April 23, 1945. The small German town of Schweinfurt sat beneath a grey sky, its cobblestone streets littered with debris from weeks of aerial bombardment. In a makeshift holding area, inside what had once been a schoolhouse, 17 women in tattered grey uniforms huddled together, their faces pale with terror. They had been told exactly what to expect from the advancing American forces, particularly from those soldiers whose skin was darker than the spring soil of Bavaria. They had been taught to fear a reckoning that seemed inevitable now, as the sound of military vehicles grew louder outside. What they could not have imagined, what their years of indoctrination had made impossible to conceive, was that the next few hours would shatter everything they believed they knew about the world and their place in it. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a group of German auxiliary personnel, captured in the final weeks of the European conflict, discovered that the propaganda they had been fed for years bore no resemblance to reality, and how an encounter with American soldiers became a lesson in humanity that would haunt them with shame and gratitude in equal measure for the rest of their lives. The morning had begun with chaos. Sergeant Erika Vogel, 24 years old, formerly of the Signals Corps attached to the German military administration in southern Germany, had watched from a second-floor window as the last German military vehicles retreated westward in disarray. She had served for 3 years, initially as a volunteer motivated by what she had been taught was patriotic duty, later because leaving had become impossible. Now, as the distant rumble of American armor grew closer, she felt her stomach twist with a fear so profound it made her hands shake uncontrollably. Beside her stood Corporal Margaret Schiller, a year younger, her blonde hair now dirty and unkempt after days without proper facilities. Margaret had worked in the logistics division, managing supply records and coordinating rail shipments. She came from a small town in Saxony, where everyone had believed what they were told, where questioning had been unthinkable, where the future promised by their leaders had seemed certain and glorious. That certainty had crumbled over the past months as the front drew closer, as the promised miracle weapons failed to materialize, as the reality of impending collapse became undeniable. In the corner of the room, Private Helga Richter, barely 20 years old, wept quietly. She had been assigned to clerical work at a regional headquarters, typing reports and filing documents. Her brother had sent her a letter months ago from the Eastern Front, describing horrors she could barely process. Now he was missing, presumed lost in the retreat from the East, and she was here, waiting for a fate she had been taught to expect would be worse than anything imaginable. The propaganda had been specific and relentless. During their training, during weekly political education sessions, through films and pamphlets and whispered warnings from their superiors, they had been told about the soldiers who would come. They had been shown images, heard descriptions, absorbed warnings that played on every fear a young woman could possess. The message had been clear and constant. Surrender meant suffering. Capture by certain enemy forces meant degradation and violence. Resistance to the last was the only honorable path. But resistance had not been possible. When the American advance had accelerated, when communication lines had collapsed, when their commanding officers had simply disappeared in the night, the women had found themselves trapped in Schweinfurt, with no transportation, no orders, and no options. A hastily assembled group of local officials had gathered them in the schoolhouse, hoping perhaps that keeping them together might afford some protection, might make formal surrender more orderly, might prevent worse outcomes than an organized capitulation. Through the windows now, they could see American jeeps entering the town square. The vehicles moved slowly, cautiously, their mounted weapons sweeping the buildings for threats. Infantry soldiers followed on foot, moving in practice patterns that spoke of extensive combat experience. The Americans had been fighting their way across Europe for nearly a year, and it showed in every careful movement, every tactical decision, every measured advance. What made Erika's breath catch in her throat, what caused Margaret to grab her arm with trembling fingers, what made Helga's quiet weeping turn to terrified silence, was the realization of who these soldiers were. As they drew closer, as the morning light fell on their faces, it became clear that the advancing unit was composed primarily of African American troops. The women had been told about these soldiers specifically. During training, instructors had devoted entire sessions to describing what they called the savage nature of colonial troops, painting lurid pictures of violence and revenge. They had been taught that these men, subjected to years of discrimination in their own country, would visit upon captured German personnel every indignity, every cruelty, every horror that propaganda could imagine. The message had been reinforced through official channels and unofficial whispers. Capture by these particular soldiers meant a fate that should be avoided at any cost, even that of one's own life. Now that moment had arrived, and 17 women faced what they believed would be their darkest hours. Corporal Anna Weber, at 31, the oldest of the group, had tried to maintain some semblance of leadership as the ranking non-commissioned officer present. She had served in administrative roles since 1941, managing personnel records at various installations across southern Germany. She had a husband somewhere in France, or at least she had 3 months ago when his last letter arrived. She had a daughter being raised by her mother in Stuttgart, a city she knew had been heavily bombed. She had spent years believing she was serving a great cause, contributing to a future of national glory and European order. That belief had eroded slowly, then collapsed entirely in the past weeks. The evidence of reality had become impossible to ignore. The streams of refugees fleeing eastward with stories of advancing forces, the increasing desperation of official communications, the obvious deterioration of military organization, the absence of the promised relief forces and wonder weapons. But even as her faith in victory had died, her fear of capture had remained visceral and overwhelming, fed by years of propaganda that had painted defeat as synonymous with degradation. She had gathered the women that morning and spoken to them with a calmness she did not feel. They should stay together, she had said. They should remain calm and dignified, she had urged. They should prepare themselves for whatever came next, she had warned, though she could not bring herself to articulate exactly what that might entail. The younger women had looked to her for reassurance she could not provide, for hope she did not possess, for strength that was rapidly draining away as the sound of American vehicles filled the street outside. Private First Class Thomas Jackson, United States Army, 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, had been fighting in Europe for 8 months. He had landed in France in August of 1944, had pushed through the autumn campaigns, had survived the bitter cold of the winter battles, and had driven deeper into Germany as spring brought better weather and accelerating advances. He was 22 years old, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he had seen more death and destruction than he had ever imagined possible in his former life as a factory worker. He had also experienced more discrimination and prejudice than he had expected when he volunteered in 1943. The army had been segregated, black soldiers relegated to support roles and labor battalions for much of the conflict's early years. But the desperate need for combat troops had eventually overcome institutional racism to some degree, and units like the 614th had been formed, trained and thrown into the fighting. They had proven themselves in dozens of engagements, earning respect from the enemy even as they struggled for recognition from their own military hierarchy. Thomas had learned to live with contradictions. He fought for a country that denied him basic rights at home. He defended freedom abroad while his family in Philadelphia faced discrimination daily. He wore the uniform of the United States Army while knowing that many of his fellow Americans viewed him as inferior simply because of his skin color. He had expected that this might embitter him, might make him angry and vengeful toward the enemy. Instead, it had given him a peculiar clarity about human nature, about the stupidity of prejudice, about the common humanity that existed beneath all the uniforms and flags and propaganda. His unit had been assigned to secure Schweinfurt, a town of moderate size that had been heavily bombed due to its ball-bearing factories but had been abandoned by German forces without significant resistance. The tank destroyers had led the advance, followed by infantry and support elements. The operation had been methodical and professional, motivated by a desire to finish the job and go home, rather than any particular animosity toward the German people. When Lieutenant James Morrison, a white officer from Ohio who commanded Thomas's platoon, received word that a group of German auxiliary personnel had been located in a schoolhouse and were requesting formal surrender, he had assigned Thomas and several other soldiers to secure the prisoners and arrange transport to a proper facility. Thomas had performed this duty before. He had processed surrendering soldiers, guarded prisoners awaiting transport, searched captured facilities. It had become routine, just another task in an endless series of tasks that made up military occupation. He expected this would be no different. Some frightened Germans, paperwork, a truck ride to wherever the prisoner collection point was currently located. He did not expect to find 17 terrified women who looked at him with expressions of absolute horror, who shrank away from his approach as if he were something monstrous, who seemed convinced that his mere presence heralded unspeakable violence. Sergeant First Class Robert Washington, who had served in the army since 1941 and had survived campaigns in North Africa and Italy before arriving in Europe, accompanied Thomas to the schoolhouse. At 29, Robert was a veteran of more combat than most soldiers would see in several wars. He had been wounded twice, decorated for valor 3 times, and had developed a reputation as a solid, reliable leader who took care of his men and got the job done without unnecessary dramatics. Robert had also developed a deep cynicism about the nature of prejudice and the stupidity of racism. He had seen too much, experienced too many contradictions, encountered too many absurdities to maintain any illusions about the rationality of human hatred. He fought for his country because it was his country, flawed as it was. He did his job because his men depended on him and because the alternative was to give in to bitterness and despair. But he had no illusions about being welcomed as a hero when he returned home, no fantasies about gratitude from a nation that still maintained separate facilities for people who looked like him. When he and Thomas entered the schoolhouse with 3 other soldiers from their unit, when they climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor where the German women had been gathered, when he saw the absolute terror in their eyes, Robert understood immediately what was happening. He had seen that look before, that specific combination of fear and resignation, that particular expression that came from someone who believed they were about to experience horrible violence and had no power to prevent it. He stopped in the doorway, holding up a hand to signal his men to halt. The women were clustered in the far corner of the classroom, as far from the door as they could manage. Some were crying. Others stared with wide, unblinking eyes. One young woman looked like she might faint. The oldest among them, a thin woman with corporal's insignia on her dirty uniform, stood slightly in front of the others, in a protective posture that was both brave and futile. Robert spoke in German, using the functional vocabulary he had picked up over months of occupation duty. His accent was terrible, his grammar probably worse, but the meaning was clear enough. "You are prisoners now," he said. "You will not be hurt. You will be treated according to the rules of war. You will be given food and water and medical attention if needed. You will be transported to a facility where proper procedures will be followed. You will be safe." The words seemed to make no impact. The women continued to stare with terrified eyes, continued to press themselves against the far wall, continued to wait for whatever horror they were convinced was imminent. Thomas moved forward slowly, his hands visible and empty, his posture as non-threatening as he could manage, while still wearing combat gear and carrying a rifle. He tried to remember the German phrases he had learned, the simple words that might convey peaceful intent. His pronunciation was even worse than Robert's, but he tried anyway. "We will not hurt you," he said. "You are safe. We are American soldiers. We follow rules." One of the younger women, the blonde one who stood near the window, began to sob more loudly. Another covered her face with her hands. The corporal who stood in front seemed to be trying to speak, but could not find words. Private Daniel Cooper, who had been a schoolteacher in Chicago before the war and had some facility with languages, stepped forward and tried a different approach. He spoke slowly and clearly, using simple German that he hoped would be understood. "We need you to come with us," he said. "You will be taken to a place where there are other prisoners. You will be registered and given quarters. You will be fed. No one will harm you. We are not going to hurt you." "That is not what we do." The women did not move. They seemed frozen in terror, unable to process what they were hearing, unable to reconcile the calm, professional words with everything they had been taught to expect. Robert made a decision. He turned to Thomas and the others. "Go get the medical kit from the jeep," he said, "and see if you can find someone who speaks better German than we do." Maybe a civilian who can translate properly. These women think we are going to hurt them, and I want them to understand clearly that we are not." As Thomas headed back down the stairs, Robert moved slowly into the room, his hands held away from his weapons, his posture as relaxed as he could make it. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it with a match, took a drag, and then held out the pack toward the women. "Cigarette?" he asked, using the German word, "Zigarette." For a long moment nothing happened. The women stared at the offered pack as if it might be a trick, a cruel joke before the violence began. Then, hesitantly, the corporal took a single step forward. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely extend them, but she reached out and took a cigarette from the pack. Robert lit it for her with another match, his movements slow and deliberate, his expression neutral and calm. The woman took a drag, coughed slightly, took another. The nicotine seemed to give her some small measure of courage. She looked at Robert directly for the first time, studying his face as if trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had been taught to expect. "You are really American soldiers?" she asked in halting English, her accent thick but comprehensible. "Yes," Robert replied. "We are really American soldiers, and you are really prisoners of war. And that is all that is happening here. No drama, no violence, just procedure and paperwork and transportation." The corporal translated this for the other women in rapid German. Some seemed skeptical, others confused, all still frightened, but perhaps slightly less convinced that immediate horror awaited them. Thomas returned with the medical kit and, more importantly, with an elderly German man who had been found in a nearby building and who spoke adequate English. The man, who introduced himself as Herr Friedrich Müller, a former teacher who had retired before the conflict began, was clearly nervous about being involved, but seemed willing to help facilitate communication. Through Herr Müller, Robert explained the situation more clearly. The women were prisoners of war. They would be processed according to international conventions. They would be asked to provide their names, ranks, and unit assignments. They would be searched for weapons, though this would be done by female personnel when they reached the proper facility. They would be given food, water, and medical attention. They would be held in appropriate quarters until decisions could be made about their status and disposition. They would be treated with the dignity accorded to prisoners under the rules of war. As Herr Müller translated, some of the tension began to drain from the room. The women were still afraid, still uncertain, but the absolute terror was fading somewhat. They were beginning to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, what they had been taught to expect was not going to happen. Erika Vogel, the sergeant who had watched the Americans arrive, found her voice for the first time since they had entered the room. "We were told," she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. She tried again. "We were told that you would hurt us, that you would hurt us very badly, that surrender to your soldiers would be worse than anything else." Robert nodded slowly, his expression hardening slightly as he understood the full implications of what she was saying. "You were lied to," he said flatly. "You were told those things by people who wanted you to be afraid, who wanted you to keep fighting, who did not care what happened to you as long as you served their purposes. We are soldiers, not monsters. We follow rules. We treat prisoners according to the law. That is what civilized militaries do." Through Herr Müller, this was translated and explained more fully. The old man added his own commentary, noting that he had heard these same lies spread throughout the community, that the propaganda had been relentless and specific, that many people had been taught to fear the advancing forces in ways that had nothing to do with reality. Margaret Schiller, the corporal who had stood with Erika at the window, asked a question in German that Herr Müller translated. "She wants to know why you are being kind to us. She says she does not understand why you would give us cigarettes and speak calmly when we are your enemies." Robert considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because you are not our enemies anymore," he said. "The fighting is over for you. You are prisoners, and prisoners have rights. And because treating you badly would not serve any purpose except to make us into the monsters you were told we were. We are better than that. We have to be better than that, or else what was the point of any of this?" This answer, when translated, seemed to confuse the women as much as reassure them. They had been taught to think of conflict in terms of absolute hatred, of existential struggle, of enemies who deserved only destruction. The idea that their captors might follow rules, might exercise restraint, might treat them with basic human dignity, even though they represented a defeated cause, did not fit into the worldview they had been given. Over the next hour, the process of surrender and initial processing continued. The women were escorted downstairs in small groups, allowed to use the bathroom facilities under guard, given water and some military ration crackers. Thomas and another soldier searched the building for weapons, finding none except for a few personal items that were carefully catalogued and stored. Corporal Anna Weber provided a roster of names and ranks, which Robert wrote down in his notebook with careful precision. Throughout this process, the soldiers maintained professional detachment mixed with basic courtesy. When one of the younger women, Helga Richter, became dizzy from hunger and stress, Daniel Cooper helped her to a chair and gave her water and food. When another woman asked permission to retrieve a photograph from her bag, she was allowed to do so after it was checked, to ensure it was indeed just a photograph and not a concealed weapon. When questions were asked about what would happen next, they were answered honestly. Transport to a larger facility, registration with proper authorities, eventual repatriation when circumstances permitted. Lieutenant Morrison arrived to oversee the final arrangements. He was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that suggested he had been an accountant or lawyer in civilian life. He spoke briefly with Robert, reviewed the roster, and made arrangements for a truck to transport the prisoners to the regional collection point in Nuremberg. While they waited for the vehicle to arrive, something remarkable began to happen. The women, having realized that they were not going to be hurt, that the soldiers were indeed following the rules they claimed to follow, began to relax incrementally. Some sat on the floor, exhausted. Others talked quietly among themselves, processing their shock and relief. A few began to cry again, but these were different tears now, tears of emotional release rather than terror. Private James Butler, a soldier from South Carolina, who had been standing guard at the door, pulled out his canteen and offered water to the women who seemed thirsty. Another soldier shared a chocolate bar from his rations, breaking it into pieces so that everyone could have a small amount. These were simple acts of basic humanity, the kind of small courtesies that soldiers might extend to anyone in distress, regardless of nationality or circumstances. For the German women, these acts carried profound weight. Everything they had been taught suggested that such behavior was impossible, that the enemy was incapable of basic human kindness, that surrender meant degradation rather than protection. Yet here they were, receiving water and chocolate and cigarettes from soldiers they had been taught to view as savage and vengeful. Erika Vogel approached Robert as he stood near the window, looking out at the street where American vehicles now filled the square. She spoke in careful English, clearly trying to find the right words. "I want to say thank you," she began. "I do not know if I should thank you. We are your enemies. We fought for a cause that you came here to stop. But you have treated us with kindness, and I was not expecting that. I was expecting something very different." Robert turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "You were taught to expect something different," he said. "Someone wanted you to be afraid, wanted you to fight harder, wanted you to choose death over surrender. But we are not what you were taught to fear. We are just soldiers doing a job, following orders, trying to finish this conflict and go home. And treating you decently is not kindness, really. It is just following the rules that are supposed to govern how nations conduct themselves, even in war." Erika nodded slowly, processing this. "In America," she said hesitantly, "are people treated equally? Are you treated the same as the white soldiers?" Robert laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No," he said bluntly. "In America, I am not treated the same as white soldiers. In America, I cannot eat in the same restaurants, cannot stay in the same hotels, cannot use the same facilities. In America, people who look like me face discrimination every day. But you know what? That does not make me into what your leaders said I was. That does not make me cruel or savage or vengeful. It just makes the people who discriminate against me wrong. And when I go home, I will still fight for my rights, will still demand equality, will still work for change. But that is a different fight in a different place for a different purpose." This answer, delivered with quiet intensity, seemed to strike Erika deeply. She stood silent for a moment, then spoke again. "We were told so many lies," she said softly. "I am beginning to understand how many lies." The truck arrived in the early afternoon, a standard military vehicle with canvas covering and bench seats in the back. The women were loaded aboard with their few belongings, 17 frightened prisoners being transported to an uncertain future, but no longer terrified of immediate violence. As they climbed into the truck, several of them looked back at the soldiers who had processed their surrender, as if trying to memorize their faces, as if wanting to remember the moment when their entire understanding of the world had shifted. Robert watched them go, then turned to Thomas. "Those women were scared to death of us," he observed. "Not just scared because they were prisoners, but specifically scared of us, because of what they had been taught about who we are." Thomas nodded. "I know," he said. "I could see it in their eyes. They thought we were going to do something terrible to them." Robert pulled out another cigarette, lit it, stared at the smoke rising into the grey afternoon sky. "And we gave them cigarettes instead," he said. "We gave them water and crackers and basic human decency, because that is what soldiers are supposed to do. That is what separates civilization from barbarism, rules from revenge, discipline from savagery." He paused, taking another drag. "Makes you think, though, about how easily people can be taught to hate, to fear, to believe the worst about other human beings. Those women were not evil. They were just young and afraid and filled with propaganda. And when they encountered reality, when they saw that we were not the monsters they had been taught to expect, their whole worldview crumbled. That is a powerful thing, truth meeting lies. Truth wins, but the lies leave scars." The truck drove away, heading north toward Nuremberg, carrying its cargo of confused and relieved prisoners. For the American soldiers, it was just another task completed, another group of prisoners processed, another small piece of the vast machinery of occupation and demobilization. For the women in the truck, it was a transformative experience that would shape the rest of their lives. In Nuremberg, the women were transferred to a larger facility that had been established to process female auxiliaries and other non-combatant personnel captured as German forces collapsed. The facility was run efficiently, with proper registration procedures, medical screening, and organized housing. The women were interviewed by intelligence officers who were interested primarily in administrative details rather than military secrets. They were fed regularly, given access to washing facilities, and allowed to write letters that would eventually be delivered to family members if addresses could be verified. During the weeks they spent in the facility, the 17 women from Schweinfurt had many opportunities to interact with other prisoners and with the Allied personnel who ran the camp. What became clear was that their experience was not unique. Throughout Germany, as the armies advanced and the regime collapsed, hundreds of thousands of prisoners were being taken and processed according to the established rules of war. The vast majority were treated correctly, fed adequately, and processed systematically. This stood in stark contrast to what they had been taught to expect. The propaganda had painted Allied forces, particularly those composed of African American soldiers or troops from other Allied nations, as barbaric and vengeful. The reality was boring in its professionalism. Forms to be filled out, rations to be distributed, procedures to be followed, rules to be obeyed. For many of the women, this created a cognitive crisis. If the propaganda about Allied soldiers had been so completely false, what else had been lies? If the regime had so thoroughly misrepresented the nature of the enemy, what other claims might have been fabricated? The psychological impact of this realization varied from person to person, but for most it marked the beginning of a long process of re-evaluating everything they had believed. Erika Vogel, during an interview with an American intelligence officer, tried to articulate this confusion. "We were told that your soldiers, particularly the black American soldiers, would treat us terribly if we were captured," she said. "We were told this very specifically many times by many different people in positions of authority. It was presented as established fact, as certain truth. But when we actually encountered those soldiers, they gave us cigarettes and water. They followed rules, they treated us correctly. So now I do not know what was true and what was false. I do not know what to believe about anything." The intelligence officer, a captain from New York who had been a lawyer before the war, nodded sympathetically. "That is a difficult position to be in," he acknowledged, "but it is also an opportunity. You can rebuild your understanding based on evidence and experience, rather than propaganda and lies. You can learn to question authority, to verify claims, to think critically about what you are told. Those are valuable skills for any citizen in any country." He paused, then added, "What you were told about our soldiers was not just false, it was deliberately false. It was designed to make you afraid, to make you fight harder, to prevent surrender even when surrender was the rational choice. The regime that told you those lies did not care about your safety or well-being. They cared about using you for their purposes, and truth was irrelevant to that goal. In the barracks where the women were housed, discussions about their capture and treatment became frequent. Different women processed the experience differently. Some felt profound shame about what they had believed, about the propaganda they had accepted without question. Others felt anger at having been lied to so systematically. A few struggled to maintain cognitive dissonance, unable to fully accept that everything they had been taught might have been false. Margarete Schiller, the young woman from Saxony, wrote a letter to her mother that tried to explain what had happened. "Dear Mother," she wrote, "I am safe and being treated well. We were captured by American forces, and I must tell you something that has changed my understanding of everything. We were told that these soldiers, particularly the black American soldiers, would treat us terribly. We were so frightened that some of us could barely stand when they arrived. But Mother, they gave us cigarettes. They gave us water and food. They treated us according to the rules of war, with correctness and even some kindness. Everything we were told was a lie. I do not know what to think anymore. I do not know what was true and what was false in all the things we were taught. I hope you are safe. I hope I will see you again soon, but I will never again accept what I am told without question. That much I have learned." The letter was reviewed by censors, found to contain no military intelligence or other problematic content, and eventually sent through the military postal system. It would reach Margaret's mother 3 months later, one small piece of communication in the vast flow of information, trying to reconnect families torn apart by the conflict. For the American soldiers, the encounter with the terrified German women was one incident among many in the complex process of occupation and demobilization. Thomas Jackson would later write in a letter to his family in Philadelphia, "We captured some German women who had been told we would hurt them in terrible ways. They were more scared of us than I've ever seen anyone scared of anything. When they realized we were just going to follow the rules and treat them like prisoners are supposed to be treated, you could see their whole understanding of the world change right in front of you. It made me angry, thinking about how they had been lied to and manipulated. But it also made me think about all the lies we have been told back home, about who is inferior and who is superior, about who deserves respect and who does not. Lies are powerful things, and truth is the only weapon against them." Robert Washington, in his own correspondence, reflected on the broader implications. These women had been taught to hate and fear us based on nothing but propaganda and racism. When confronted with reality, when treated with basic human decency, their hatred crumbled because it had no foundation in truth. This makes me think about the hatred and prejudice we face at home. It is built on the same foundation of lies and propaganda. And maybe, just maybe, when people are confronted with reality, when they interact with us as fellow human beings rather than as caricatures, that hatred will crumble too. It is a hopeful thought anyway. We will see if it proves true when we get home. The 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion continued its duties in occupied Germany through the spring and summer of 1945. They participated in the complex tasks of military government, security operations, and support for displaced persons. The unit was recognized for its professional conduct and combat effectiveness, though such recognition often came grudgingly from a military establishment that still maintained racial segregation as official policy. The irony was not lost on the African-American soldiers who served in Europe. They had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom and democracy, had performed their duties with courage and professionalism, had treated even their enemies with the dignity prescribed by international law, and would return home to a country where they were still denied basic civil rights. This contradiction would fuel the growing civil rights movement in the years to come, as veterans who had fought abroad refused to accept second-class citizenship at home. For the German women captured in Schweinfurt and processed through the system, The experience marked a turning point. Most would be repatriated within a year as Allied authorities worked through the massive numbers of prisoners and displaced persons. They would return to a Germany that was physically destroyed, politically transformed, and psychologically shattered. The country they had known was gone, replaced by occupation zones and uncertain future. Erika Vogel would eventually make her way back to her family in Stuttgart. She would find her daughter safe, her mother exhausted but alive, her husband missing, and later confirmed as having been lost in the final weeks of fighting. She would spend years trying to rebuild a life in a shattered country, working first in the rubble-clearing crews and later in the administrative offices of the new German government that emerged under Allied supervision. She would never forget the moment when American soldiers had offered her a cigarette instead of the violence she had been taught to expect, and she would spend the rest of her life speaking against prejudice and propaganda in all its forms. Margarete Schiller would return to her family in Saxony, which became part of the Soviet occupation zone and later East Germany. Her experience with American forces stood in contrast to the harsher treatment often encountered under Soviet authority, and this would shape her perspective on the different occupying powers. She would eventually flee to West Germany in the 1950s, seeking opportunities unavailable in the Communist East, and would build a new life as a teacher, using her own experiences to educate young people about the dangers of propaganda and the importance of critical thinking. Helga Richter, the youngest of the captured women, would struggle for years with the psychological trauma of the war and its aftermath. The collapse of everything she had been taught to believe, combined with the loss of her brother and the destruction of her hometown, would leave emotional scars that never fully healed. But she would also develop a fierce commitment to peace and international understanding, working with various reconciliation organizations and speaking to school groups about her experiences. She would say, often, that the moment when American soldiers had treated her with basic human decency, when she expected violence, was the moment she began to understand that humanity was stronger than ideology. Anna Weber, the corporal who had tried to lead the women through their capture, would reunite with her husband, who had survived captivity in France and returned home in late 1946. Together they would rebuild their lives in Bavaria, raising their daughter, and working to create a normal existence in a society that was fundamentally changed. Anna would become active in organizations promoting international understanding and peace education, and would maintain a correspondence for years with Herr Müller, the elderly teacher who had helped translate during their surrender. They would often discuss the importance of truth over propaganda, of human connection over ideological division, of reality over manufactured fear. The broader historical significance of encounters like the one in Schweinfurt extended beyond the personal transformations of those directly involved. As Germany was occupied and rebuilt, as denazification programs attempted to re-educate the population, as new institutions were established to replace those that had been destroyed, the gap between propaganda and reality became a central theme in the reconstruction of German society. Millions of Germans, military and civilian alike, discovered that much of what they had been taught about the war, about their enemies, about the nature of the conflict, had been fabricated or distorted. This revelation was traumatic for many, producing denial, anger, shame, and eventually for some, a commitment to ensuring such manipulation could never happen again. The treatment of prisoners by Allied forces, particularly American forces, became a point of contrast with the treatment that German prisoners had sometimes experienced on other fronts, and with the treatment that prisoners in German custody had often received. The systematic adherence to international law, the generally correct treatment of prisoners, the provision of adequate food and medical care, all stood as evidence that warfare could be conducted according to rules, that even enemies could be treated as human beings deserving of basic dignity. This was not always or uniformly true. There were instances of mistreatment, of rules being broken, of revenge replacing discipline. War is conducted by human beings, and human beings are fallible, capable of cruelty, even when rules exist to prevent it. But the systematic policy of the Allied forces, particularly the American forces in Western Europe, was to adhere to the Geneva Conventions and to treat prisoners correctly. This policy was maintained even when it would have been emotionally satisfying to do otherwise, even when prisoners came from a regime that had committed terrible atrocities, even when the human desire for revenge might have seemed justified. For African American soldiers in particular, this represented a profound moral choice. They came from a society that discriminated against them, that denied them equal rights, that treated them as second-class citizens. They had every reason to be bitter, to be angry, to exercise whatever power they possessed in ways that reflected their own experiences of injustice. Yet the overwhelming majority chose professionalism over revenge, discipline over anger, adherence to rules over emotional satisfaction. This choice had multiple motivations. Some soldiers were simply following orders and military training. Others were motivated by personal ethics and moral principles. Many understood that their conduct reflected not just on themselves, but on their entire community, that any mistreatment of prisoners would be used to justify continued discrimination at home, that they had to be better than perfect, to be considered barely adequate by a society that judged them by different standards than it applied to white soldiers. But there was also a deeper understanding, among many African American soldiers, of the corrosive nature of prejudice and the importance of human dignity. Having experienced discrimination based on skin color, they recognized similar patterns in the propaganda that had taught German women to fear them. Having been dehumanized by racism at home, they refused to dehumanize others in turn. Having been subjected to treatment that violated their fundamental human worth, they insisted on treating even their enemies with the respect due to human beings. This moral stance would become increasingly important in the post-war years. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, veterans of the European conflict would bring with them the experience of having fought for freedom abroad and the determination to secure freedom at home. The contradiction of fighting against tyranny overseas while living under segregation at home became increasingly untenable, and veterans were among the leaders demanding change. The women who had surrendered in Schweinfurt, who had expected revenge and received cigarettes instead, carried their own lessons forward. In the new Germany that emerged from the ruins, in the complex process of rebuilding a nation and a society, the importance of confronting propaganda with truth became a central theme. Organizations dedicated to democratic education, to teaching critical thinking, to preventing the manipulation of populations through manufactured fear, would draw on the experiences of those who had discovered the gap between what they had been taught and what was real. Erika Vogel, speaking to a group of students in the 1960s, would describe the moment of her capture this way. "I stood in that schoolhouse expecting the worst things human beings can do to each other. I had been taught to expect violence and degradation, and instead, a soldier offered me a cigarette. Such a small gesture, such a simple act of normal human interaction. But it shattered everything I had been taught to believe. It showed me that propaganda works by making you afraid of other human beings, by making you believe that they are monsters rather than people. And when you actually encounter them, when you see that they are just people who follow rules and treat you with basic decency, all the lies collapse. That is why propaganda must always avoid actual human contact, must always work through fear and abstraction. Reality is the enemy of lies." This understanding, born from personal experience, would influence how post-war Germany approached education, media, and the prevention of future manipulation. The importance of direct human contact, of personal interaction, of reality over abstraction, became principles embedded in democratic education and civic society. The American soldiers who had processed the surrender in Schweinfurt, meanwhile returned home to their own struggles for justice and equality. Thomas Jackson went back to Philadelphia, returned to factory work, became active in the labor movement and civil rights organizations. He would participate in demonstrations for fair employment, in campaigns for open housing, in the long, difficult fight for equality that continued for decades after the war ended. Robert Washington remained in the army, one of the soldiers who pushed for integration of the military forces in the late 1940s. When President Truman ordered the desegregation of the armed forces in 1948, Robert was among those who helped implement the new policies, training integrated units, and working to overcome the resistance of those who preferred the old segregated system. He would retire as a senior non-commissioned officer in the 1960s, having spent his entire adult life in service to a country that had slowly, grudgingly, begun to extend him the full rights of citizenship. Daniel Cooper returned to teaching in Chicago, bringing with him a deeper understanding of propaganda, prejudice, and the importance of critical thinking. He would become known for his innovative approaches to teaching history and civics, for his insistence that students learn to question authority and verify claims, for his commitment to showing them how easily populations could be manipulated if they did not think carefully about what they were told. The encounter in Schweinfurt, like thousands of similar encounters across Germany in the final months and aftermath of the European conflict, represented a moment when propaganda met reality and collapsed under the weight of truth. It showed that human beings, when confronted with actual evidence rather than manufactured fear, could recognize lies for what they were. It demonstrated that professional military conduct, adherence to rules, and basic human decency could coexist even in the context of warfare. It proved that revenge was a choice, not an inevitability, and that discipline could overcome the desire for retaliation. These lessons were important then and remain important now. The techniques of propaganda that were used to teach German women to fear American soldiers, particularly African-American soldiers, are the same techniques used in every era to manufacture hatred and division. The creation of fear through abstraction, the denial of common humanity, the use of stereotypes and fabricated narratives, the appeal to prejudice and base emotion rather than reason and evidence, all these remain tools of those who seek to manipulate populations for political purposes. The antidote, as those 17 women discovered in a schoolhouse in Schweinfurt, is reality. When people actually encounter those they have been taught to hate, when direct human contact replaces abstract fear, when evidence confronts propaganda, truth has a power that lies cannot match. This does not mean that prejudice instantly disappears or that hatred evaporates at first contact. Human psychology is more complex than that, and people can cling to false beliefs even in the face of contradictory evidence. But reality creates possibilities for change that propaganda alone cannot prevent. The women who surrendered that April day in 1945 had their worldview fundamentally challenged by the simple act of soldiers following rules and treating them with basic respect. This challenge opened spaces for questioning, for re-evaluation, for the slow, difficult work of rebuilding understanding on foundations of truth rather than lies. The soldiers who offered cigarettes instead of revenge demonstrated that humans could choose to be better than their basest impulses, could rise above the hatred that had been directed at them both by their enemies and by their own society, could maintain their humanity even in inhumane circumstances. This was not easy for them. It required discipline, training, moral courage, and a commitment to principles that went beyond immediate emotional satisfaction. It required them to be, as Robert Washington had said, better than the monsters they had been described as, to prove through their actions that the propaganda was false. It required them to treat their enemies with a dignity that their own country often denied them, to extend humanity to those who had fought for a regime built on denying humanity to millions. That they did so, that they maintained professional standards and adhered to the rules of war, that they treated prisoners correctly even when those prisoners had been taught to expect horror, speaks to the strength of military discipline, to the power of ethical training, and to the fundamental decency that exists in most human beings when given the structure and support to express it. The 17 women would never forget what happened in that schoolhouse. For the rest of their lives, in conversations with family and friends, in testimony to historical researchers, in presentations to students and civic groups, they would return to that moment when their expectations met reality and everything they had believed proved false. They would describe the terror they felt, the lies they had been taught, and the profound impact of discovering that their enemies were simply human beings, doing their jobs according to rules and professional standards. They would speak of shame for having believed such lies about other human beings. They would express anger at those who had lied to them, who had used their fear as a tool of control, who had cared nothing for their safety or well-being. They would acknowledge the difficulty of rebuilding their understanding of the world, of questioning everything they had once accepted as truth, of learning to think critically about claims made by authority. But they would also speak of gratitude, gratitude for soldiers who had treated them with decency when they expected violence, gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild their lives and their understanding, gratitude for the lesson, however painful, that reality was more complex and more humane than propaganda had suggested. Gratitude for the chance to become better people than they had been when they wore the uniform of a regime built on lies. In the broader sweep of history, these individual stories might seem like minor footnotes to the vast narrative of global conflict. Millions died in the war. Entire cities were destroyed, nations were conquered and occupied, the map of the world was redrawn. The surrender of 17 women in a small German town, their terror and relief, their transformation from propaganda victims to critical thinkers might appear insignificant against such massive events. But history is built from individual experiences, from personal transformations, from moments when human beings confront truth and make choices about how to respond. The encounter in Schweinfurt mattered because it showed that even in the midst of total war, even when hatred and fear had been systematically cultivated, even when every reason existed for revenge and cruelty, human beings could choose differently. They could choose to follow rules, to treat others with dignity, to rise above their circumstances and their grievances, to act with professional discipline and basic decency. This choice, replicated thousands of times across Europe as the war ended and occupation began, helped create the conditions for eventual reconciliation and reconstruction. It demonstrated to defeated populations that the victors were not the monsters propaganda had depicted, opening space for cooperation in the difficult work of rebuilding. It showed that even enemies could find common ground in shared humanity, that the distinctions between peoples were less profound than the things that united them as human beings. For African American soldiers in particular, the experience of being able to demonstrate their humanity and professionalism despite both German propaganda and American racism was transformative. They had proven themselves in combat, had shown they could perform any military task as well as any other soldiers, had demonstrated leadership and courage under fire. And they had shown that they could win not just military victories but moral victories, treating even their enemies better than their own country often treated them. This would fuel their determination to secure full citizenship rights at home. Having fought for freedom abroad, having demonstrated every quality that should entitle them to respect and equality, they would no longer accept the second-class status that American society had assigned them. The civil rights movement, that would transform America in the decades after the war, drew much of its energy and leadership from veterans who had seen a different world, who had proven themselves by any measure, and who refused to continue accepting discrimination and segregation. The German women, for their part, became witnesses to the power of propaganda and the importance of resisting it. In the new Germany that emerged from the ashes of the old, their testimonies about what they had been taught and what they had experienced became part of the complex process of democratic education. They showed younger generations how easily people could be manipulated, how propaganda worked, what the consequences of unquestioning acceptance of official narratives could be. Their story also illustrated something important about the nature of reconciliation. It was not enough to simply defeat the regime that had caused such destruction. It was necessary to reach the people who had supported that regime, to show them that what they had been taught was false, to create opportunities for them to rebuild their understanding on better foundations. This required patience, professionalism, and a willingness to treat even enemies as capable of change and growth. The soldiers who offered cigarettes instead of revenge demonstrated this possibility. They could have justified harsh treatment of prisoners, could have found reasons for cruelty, or at minimum for cold indifference. Instead, they chose to follow the rules, to maintain their professional standards, to treat prisoners with the basic respect due to human beings. This choice created the possibility for transformation, for learning, for eventual reconciliation. It was not a perfect process. Many Germans never fully confronted what they had supported, never truly understood the enormity of what had been done in their name, never moved beyond justification and denial. Many American soldiers returned home to continued discrimination and prejudice, to a society that still refused to recognize their full humanity and rights. The world that emerged from the war was complex and flawed, marked by new divisions and conflicts even as old ones were resolved. But the encounter in Schweinfurt and thousands like it represented moments when better possibilities became visible, moments when the cycle of violence and revenge could be broken, when enemies could recognize each other's humanity, when rules and discipline could triumph over hatred and fear. These moments mattered, not because they solved everything, but because they showed that solutions were possible, that human beings could choose to be better than their circumstances might otherwise make them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.